In the spring of 1452, in a stone farmhouse outside the village of Vinci, a child was born who would never inherit anything. Not land, not name, not the right to join his father's profession. The notary Piero da Vinci had taken a peasant girl named Caterina to bed, and the result of that union arrived screaming into a world that had already decided his place in it. Illegitimate. The word followed him like a shadow, written in the margins of baptismal records, whispered in doorways, stamped onto every official document that would ever bear his name. And yet, this catastrophic beginning, this absolute denial of everything Renaissance Italy valued, freed a mind that would see further than any before it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The baby was baptized Leonardo, son of Sir Piero of Vinci. Not Leonardo da Vinci as we know him now, but simply Leonardo of Vinci, the bastard boy from the hills. His mother Caterina disappeared from official records within months, married off to a local kiln worker named a Caterina, which means troublemaker. She vanished into the working class, leaving her infant son to be raised in his father's household, a guest in a home that would never truly be his. Consider what this meant. In 15th century Florence, legitimacy determined everything. Legitimate sons inherited property, businesses, guild memberships, the accumulated knowledge of their father's professions. They received formal education in Latin, mathematics, rhetoric. They were groomed for positions of influence and wealth. Leonardo received none of this. He could not become a notary like his father, could not join the guild, could not attend university. The doors that opened automatically for legitimate children remained locked to him. Yet in that farmhouse in Vinci, something extraordinary was unfolding. His grandfather Antonio, a man who kept meticulous records of harvest yields and weather patterns, noticed the boy. While Piero pursued his notary business in Florence, securing a position with the Medici and marrying a respectable merchant's daughter named Albiera, Antonio watched his illegitimate grandson with growing fascination. Leonardo drew, not the careful exercises of formal training, but obsessive, endless documentation of everything his eyes could reach. He drew the way birds flew, wing positions changing through each beat. He drew water flowing over stones, not as a simple line, but as turbulent patterns that repeated at different scales. He drew his own hands from impossible angles, teaching himself perspective through pure observation. Antonio saved these drawings, recognizing something he couldn't name. The boy was left-handed, which in that era carried its own stigma. Left-handedness was associated with the sinister, the devil's mark. Teachers beat it out of children, forcing them to use their right hands for writing and eating. But there was no teacher to correct Leonardo. In the hills of Vinci, he used whichever hand felt natural, and his left hand proved extraordinary. He could draw a perfect circle freehand, a feat that stunned anyone who witnessed it. The control was absolute. As if his hand moved along invisible grooves, he collected stones, not randomly but with purpose that suggested understanding beyond his years. Fossils embedded in limestone, crystals cleaved to reveal geometric perfection, rocks that showed layers of different colors stacked like pages in a book. He arranged them, studied them, drew them with such precision that you could identify the exact type of stone from his sketches. He was teaching himself geology without knowing the word existed. There were injured birds, carried home in careful hands. A falcon with a broken wing, splintered with small sticks. A sparrow stunned by flying into a window, kept warm until it could fly again. He drew them as he healed them, documenting feather arrangement, bone structure visible through translucent skin, the way their feet gripped his fingers. Years later, when he designed flying machines, these childhood observations would form the foundation of his understanding. Imagine this boy, wandering the Tuscan hills alone, answerable to no one, because no one quite knew what to do with him. While legitimate sons sat in classrooms conjugating Latin verbs, Leonardo taught himself by watching the world work. He learned optics by observing how objects appeared different sizes at different distances, how colors faded with atmospheric haze, how water became a mirror under certain lighting conditions. He learned anatomy by watching horses move, farmers work, his own body respond to effort. His stepmother, Albiera, Piero's first legitimate wife, took pity on the boy. She had no children of her own, and perhaps saw in Leonardo's hunger for knowledge something that moved her. Secretly, against the customs that forbade teaching bastard children beyond basic skills, she taught him to read. Not Latin, which was reserved for proper education, but Italian. She gave him access to books, dangerous things in a world where knowledge was carefully controlled by the church and guilds. They read poetry together. Dante's Inferno, with its precise descriptions of hell's architecture. Petrarch's sonnets that treated language like a medium, as malleable as clay. These weren't the classical texts that formed proper Renaissance education, but they awakened something in Leonardo's mind. Language could describe what eyes saw. Words could capture motion, emotion, the quality of light. Albiera died in childbirth when Leonardo was about 10 years old, trying to give Piero the legitimate heir he desperately wanted. The baby died with her. Leonardo lost the only person who had treated his intelligence as something valuable rather than suspicious. The grief was compounded by what came next. Piero married again, a younger woman named Francesca who would indeed provide legitimate heirs. Suddenly, Leonardo's position in the household shifted from uncertain to untenable. A legitimate son arrived, then another. Half-brothers who would inherit everything. The farmhouse that Antonio had allowed Leonardo to treat as a laboratory for his observations became crowded with proper children who belonged there by law and custom. Leonardo was 14, 15, an awkward age made more awkward by having no clear future. He couldn't inherit. He couldn't join his father's profession. He was too old to be apprenticed to a trade through normal channels, too uneducated for university, too illegitimate for positions that required respectability. But he could draw. His skill had developed beyond childhood promise into something undeniable. Antonio showed Piero some of Leonardo's sketches, possibly hoping to prove the boy had value. Piero, with the calculating mind of a successful notary, recognized opportunity. Fine artists commanded high prices. The Medici paid fortunes for masterworks. If Leonardo had genuine talent, perhaps his illegitimacy could be overcome through exceptional skill. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but revealing in its persistence, about what happened next. A peasant asked Piero to have a wooden shield decorated in Florence. Piero gave it to Leonardo as a test. The boy disappeared into a room for weeks, collecting dead animals, insects, bats, lizards, studying their features. What he created was so terrifying that when Piero first saw it, he recoiled in genuine fear. Leonardo had painted a creature emerging from darkness, a chimera assembled from real observations, breathing steam, eyes burning, so lifelike that it seemed about to crawl from the wood. Piero, ever the businessman, sold the shield for a fortune and gave the peasant a cheap replacement. But more importantly, he recognized that his bastard son possessed something rare enough to be marketable. He took Leonardo to Florence, to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, the most prestigious artist in the city. Verrocchio agreed to take Leonardo as an apprentice, though the circumstances were unusual. Leonardo was older than typical apprentices, uneducated in classical languages, illegitimate. But Verrocchio saw the shield painting, saw the drawings, saw potential that outweighed conventional requirements. The deal was struck. Leonardo would enter the workshop, learning the business of art, from grinding pigments to gold leafing to sculpture and painting. What neither Piero nor Verrocchio fully understood was that they were unleashing something unprecedented. Leonardo arrived in Florence with 15 years of unstructured observation, a mind trained by nature rather than books, questions formed by watching the world rather than reading what ancient authorities claimed about it. He had learned to see without the filter of received wisdom, to question without the burden of what everyone knew to be true. The journey from Vinci to Florence was only about 25 miles, but it might as well have crossed continents. Leonardo left behind the hills where he'd roamed free, the stones and birds and flowing water that had been his teachers. He entered a city of 70,000 people, of wealth beyond imagining, of power plays and artistic competition, of churches commissioning works for thousands of florins, of the Medici banking empire that controlled European finance. He arrived with nothing, no inheritance, no education, no legitimate name, just a mind that had learned to see what others missed, hands that could render vision into reality, and the certain knowledge that he would never belong to the world that was about to shape him. His grandfather Antonio had recognized genius. Verrocchio was about to discover it. But Leonardo himself, walking through Florence's gates for the first time, could not have imagined what his catastrophic birth had actually given him. The denial of everything traditional had created space for something entirely new. The boy who could draw perfect circles freehand, who had taught himself perspective by watching hills recede into distance, who had learned anatomy from injured birds and geology from mountain streams, was about to transform what art could be and what a single human mind could accomplish. His illegitimacy, the curse that stamped every document bearing his name, had freed him from the very traditions he would transcend. In the workshop of Verrocchio, sleeping with grinding stones because he couldn't afford better, Leonardo would discover that poverty and exclusion were not obstacles to genius. They were its furnace. The workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio occupied several floors of a building near the old market, and when Leonardo first entered it, the noise must have been overwhelming. Hammers striking metal, grinding stones, crushing minerals into powder, apprentices calling measurements across the space, the hiss of hot wax for casting, the acrid smell of chemical preparations mixing with wood dust and turpentine. This was not the quiet studio of romantic imagination. It was a factory, producing art and engineering on commission for the wealthiest patrons in Florence. Leonardo slept on the floor near the grinding stones, not because space was limited, but because he couldn't pay for better. Verrocchio ran his workshop like a business, and apprentices fell into clear hierarchies based on what their families could afford. Boys from wealthy families paid substantial fees and received beds, proper meals, individual instruction. They were being groomed for careers as independent masters, given the tools and knowledge to establish their own workshops eventually. Leonardo received none of this. His father had negotiated his placement, but provided no ongoing support. The boy who arrived from Vinci with nothing would have to earn everything through labor. He was assigned the work nobody wanted, grinding pigments until his hands cramped, preparing wooden panels through dozens of tedious steps, cleaning brushes, tending furnaces through winter nights, sweeping floors, hauling water. The brutal, repetitive tasks that kept a workshop functioning. But here's what Verrocchio didn't anticipate. Where wealthy apprentices saw drudgery to be endured until they could do real work, Leonardo saw education. Every task became an opportunity for observation that would later revolutionize art and science. Consider the grinding of pigments. This was perhaps the most tedious job in any Renaissance workshop. Minerals had to be crushed into powder, fine enough to suspend in oil or egg tempera. Different pigments required different grinding times, different pressures, different techniques. Lapis lazuli for ultramarine blue needed gentle grinding to preserve its color. Earth pigments could be ground more aggressively. Some pigments were toxic. Some were unstable in certain mixtures. Some changed color when exposed to light or combined with particular binders. Wealthy apprentices ground pigments until they were told to stop, then gladly moved to other tasks. Leonardo ground pigments and watched what happened. He noticed that particle size affected how light interacted with the paint. Coarsely ground pigment scattered light differently than finely ground powder. He discovered that layering translucent pigments created different effects than mixing them. He learned that some colors appeared to advance toward the viewer while others receded. not because of symbolic meaning, but because of optical properties. He began experimenting in ways that horrified the other apprentices. He was supposed to grind vermilion to a specific consistency, but he ground batches to different fineness, documenting how each affected the final appearance. He mixed pigments that weren't supposed to be mixed, recording which combinations created new hues and which turned to mud. He was wasting expensive materials on curiosity, behavior that should have gotten him dismissed. But Verrocchio noticed something. The boy's experiments were producing results. Leonardo figured out how to layer cheaper pigments to mimic the appearance of expensive ones. He discovered that a carefully applied glaze of common red ochre over lead white could create a glow similar to vermilion at a fraction of the cost. These weren't random trials. Leonardo was teaching himself optics through grinding stones, understanding how human eyes perceived color before the science existed to explain it. The preparation of wooden panels was equally instructive. A panel for painting required extensive treatment. The wood had to be seasoned, joined, covered with linen, coated with gesso, sanded smooth. Each step had to be perfect, or the final painting would crack, warp, or delaminate. It took weeks to prepare a single panel properly. Leonardo prepared hundreds, and as he worked, he studied the wood itself. He noticed how different species behaved. Oak was stable but heavy. Poplar was lighter but required more careful joinery. He observed how wood grain ran, how knots created weak points, how moisture affected dimensional stability. He began to understand trees as mechanical structures, systems that moved water from roots to leaves, that grew by adding rings that recorded weather patterns. Years later, his notebooks would contain detailed observations about tree branching that predicted modern fractal geometry. The total cross-sectional area of all branches at any height equals the cross-sectional area of the trunk below them. This wasn't mysticism, it was hydraulics understood, through preparing panels, through touching thousands of pieces of wood, through asking why trees grew in particular patterns. Tending the furnaces taught him metallurgy. Bronze casting required maintaining precise temperatures for hours or days. Too hot and the metal became brittle. Too cool and it wouldn't flow into the mold properly. Leonardo spent winter nights feeding carefully measured amounts of charcoal, watching how different additives affected flame color and temperature, learning to read heat by eye because the workshop couldn't afford expensive pyrometers. He witnessed the entire casting process, creating wax models that would be invested in clay molds, heating the molds until the wax melted out, leaving a cavity, pouring molten bronze into the void. The drama when a cast failed, when metal broke through weak spots in the mold, when air bubbles created voids in the final piece. Each failure taught lessons about fluid dynamics, about how molten metal behaved, about the difference between theoretical designs and physical reality. While wealthy apprentices learned casting as a series of steps to follow, Leonardo learned it as a system to understand. Why did metal flow faster through some channels than others? How did temperature affect viscosity? What happened at the molecular level when bronze solidified? These questions weren't part of the curriculum. They were the questions of someone who had learned to watch the world work, the same pattern repeated with every task. Mixing varnishes taught him chemistry. Maintaining tools taught him mechanics. Organizing the workshop's inventory taught him systems thinking. Poverty had created a situation where Leonardo had to perform every menial task personally, and his curiosity transformed drudgery into comprehensive education. But the defining moment, the instant when his genius became undeniable, came with a painting commission that Verrocchio almost didn't give him. In 1475, when Leonardo was about 23 years old, Verrocchio's workshop received a commission for the baptism of Christ. It was a standard subject, requested countless times with established iconography. Christ in the Jordan River, John the Baptist performing the baptism, angels attending, a dove representing the Holy Spirit descending from heaven. Verrocchio would paint the main figures. He assigned Leonardo, now a senior apprentice, to paint one of the angels. It was a minor role, meant to demonstrate competence before allowing independent work. Angels in such compositions typically occupied the background, their importance secondary to the central drama. Verrocchio expected a technically proficient but unremarkable figure that wouldn't distract from his own work. Leonardo approached the task differently. He couldn't afford the expensive pigments Verrocchio used for the central figures, but years of grinding pigments had taught him something revolutionary. He began layering translucent glazes, building up color through dozens of thin applications rather than single opaque layers. Each glaze was barely visible, but together they created depth unlike anything the workshop had seen. For flesh tones, where other painters used expensive vermilion and lead white mixed opaquely, Leonardo layered translucent earth pigments over a light base, creating skin that seemed to have blood beneath it. The technique required patience. Each layer had to dry before the next could be applied. It took weeks to create what another painter would finish in days. But the result was luminous, alive in a way that opaque painting could never achieve. He had memorized human anatomy from public baths. Wealthy apprentices hired models, but Leonardo couldn't afford them. Instead, he went to public bathing houses where for a few coins, anyone could observe human bodies in various states of undress and activity. He watched how skin stretched over muscle, how tendons stood out during certain movements, how light revealed bone structure beneath flesh. He drew from memory, training his mind to retain visual information with photographic accuracy. His angel emerged from these observations and innovations. The face showed understanding of facial muscles that wouldn't be formally documented for another 2 centuries. The hair fell in curls that demonstrated understanding of spiral geometry. The hands showed anatomical precision that suggested Leonardo had studied bones and tendons. The drapery fell in folds that obeyed gravitational physics. But more than technical accuracy, the angel possessed something unprecedented. It had presence. While Verrocchio's figures occupied the panel, Leonardo's angel seemed to exist in actual space, to possess weight and volume and the potential for movement. The head turned with naturalistic ease. The eyes engaged with the scene with apparent thought. This wasn't a symbol of an angel. It was a figure that might breathe. When Verrocchio saw the completed section, the moment that would echo through art history occurred. According to Vasari, writing decades later, Verrocchio put down his brushes and never painted again. The story is probably exaggerated, but it contains essential truth. The master recognized that his apprentice had achieved something beyond his own capabilities. Leonardo had been taught techniques. He had invented a method. The difference was everything. The painting was completed and delivered, and word spread through Florence's artistic community. The illegitimate apprentice who slept with grinding stones had surpassed masters who commanded huge fees. But Leonardo's situation didn't immediately improve. He had demonstrated genius, but he still had no money, no independent commissions, no way to establish his own workshop. He began keeping notebooks, a practice that would continue until his death. But these early notebooks reveal the constraints under which he worked. The paper was cheap, bought in small quantities, because that's all he could afford. Every margin was filled, every blank space used. Nothing was wasted, and he began writing in mirror script, a practice that has fascinated historians for centuries. The standard explanation is that he was hiding his ideas from potential thieves or from church authorities who might find his observations heretical. There's truth to both explanations. But there's also a simpler reason that poverty provides. Leonardo was left-handed. Writing from left to right smeared wet ink across the page as his hand moved. Expensive inks dried quickly. Cheap inks remained wet longer. Mirror writing allowed his hand to move away from what he'd written, preventing smears. It also used ink more efficiently because each stroke was precise, not blurred by accidental contact. What began as a practical solution to poverty became his signature method. the notebooks filled with backwards text that required mirrors to read easily, creating an accidental encryption that preserved ideas until centuries after his death. His anatomical observations intensified during these years. Florence had no shortage of corpses. Plague, warfare, accidents, executions, disease. Bodies of people with no families to claim them ended up in public morgues. Leonardo gained access, probably through connections at the workshop, and began systematic dissections. He worked at night, by candlelight, in cold rooms where decomposition slowed. He drew what he found with astonishing precision: the branching of blood vessels, the structure of the eye, the layering of muscles, the architecture of bones. He made discoveries that wouldn't be officially recognized for hundreds of years. He documented the 4 chambers of the heart when medical texts claimed it had 3. He showed heart valves that prevented backward blood flow. He drew the fetus in the womb with accuracy that matched modern understanding. These weren't casual sketches. They were scientific illustrations that combined artistic skill with investigative rigor. He drew the same structure from multiple angles, in cross-section, showing how parts connected to create systems. He was inventing medical illustration as a discipline while unable to afford proper paper. His geological observations expanded through canal engineering work that the workshop occasionally contracted for. Florence and Milan both struggled with water management. Canals silted up, rivers flooded. Water power needed to be harnessed for mills and machinery. Engineering projects required understanding how water moved, how to calculate volumes and flows, how to design structures that would withstand hydraulic pressure. Leonardo found seashells embedded in rock formations on mountaintops. The official explanation, endorsed by the church, was that they were remains from Noah's flood. But Leonardo's observations contradicted this. The shells weren't scattered randomly, as flood debris would be. They were organized in layers, sometimes miles thick, showing evidence of having lived and died where they were found. He calculated how long it would take water to deposit such layers. Not 40 days, millions of years. He couldn't publish these observations. Challenging Genesis was heresy, punishable by burning. So he hid his calculations in notebooks, disguised as notes for painting backgrounds, embedded in discussions of perspective and landscape. The truth was there, encrypted by obscurity, waiting for a future that might understand what he'd discovered. By his mid-20s, Leonardo had transformed apprenticeship into a comprehensive education, unlike anything formal institutions provided. He understood optics through grinding pigments. He knew anatomy through dissecting bodies. He grasped geology through canal work. He comprehended chemistry through mixing varnishes and casting bronze. He had taught himself mathematics through practical problems of perspective and proportion, but he was still poor, still dependent on workshop wages, still unable to establish himself independently. The genius that Verrocchio recognized couldn't yet support itself financially. The angel that surpassed the master had made Leonardo famous among artists. But fame didn't automatically translate to income, and then came the accusation that would change everything, that would transform Leonardo from rising artist to fugitive, that would force him to become something other than what he'd trained to be. The machinery of genius had been assembled through poverty and obsessive curiosity. Now it would be tested by survival itself. On the 9th of April, 1476, an anonymous accusation was placed in a tamburo, one of the locked boxes positioned throughout Florence, where citizens could denounce crimes anonymously. The accusation named Leonardo da Vinci and 3 other young men of engaging in sodomy with a 17-year-old male model named Jacopo Saltarelli. In Renaissance Florence, this was a capital offense, punishable by burning at the stake. Leonardo was 24 years old. In 2 months, he would learn whether he would live or die. The accusation wasn't unusual in itself. Florence had a reputation throughout Europe for tolerating, even expecting, such relationships among young men. The city maintained an office of the night specifically to investigate these accusations, processing hundreds of cases annually. Most resulted in fines or brief imprisonment, but some resulted in execution, particularly when the accused lacked powerful protectors or when examples needed to be made. Leonardo had no protectors. He was illegitimate, unable to join guilds, without family wealth or political connections. One of his co-accused, however, came from a different world. Leonardo Tornabuoni was related to the Medici family through marriage, part of Florence's ruling elite. His inclusion in the accusation changed its dynamics entirely. The case proceeded to the office of the knight, but something unusual happened. After 2 months of investigation, the accusation was dismissed without trial. No fines, no punishment, no official record of guilt. The dismissal happened so cleanly, so completely, that historians have debated for centuries what actually occurred. The most likely explanation is that Tornabuoni's family intervened, that Medici influence made the accusation disappear. But for Leonardo, those 2 months waiting for judgment were transformative. Imagine knowing that at any moment the machinery of law might decide your life was forfeit, that you could be stripped, bound, and burned in a public square as entertainment and moral instruction, that your accomplishments meant nothing against an anonymous accusation. The fear changed him. When the dismissal came, Leonardo didn't feel relief so much as recognition of a fundamental truth. Florence was not safe. His talent couldn't protect him. His growing reputation meant nothing without political power. He was vulnerable in ways that wealthy, legitimate artists never would be. And there was another accusation. In 1477, just over a year later, someone placed another denunciation in a tamburo. Leonardo's name appeared again, this time alone, accused of the same offense. Again, the case was dismissed, but the message was clear. Someone wanted him afraid, wanted him to understand that his existence in Florence depended on the tolerance of people he couldn't identify and couldn't defend himself against. Leonardo began planning his escape. For 18 months, he worked in secret on a project unlike anything Verrocchio's workshop had produced. He was designing a portfolio, but not of artwork. He was creating a comprehensive presentation of military engineering, weapons systems, siege equipment, defensive fortifications, and tactical innovations. He was transforming himself from artist to military engineer, from painter of angels to designer of machines that killed. Why this dramatic shift? Because Leonardo understood power. Artists depended on patrons who could withdraw support on whim. But engineers, particularly military engineers, became indispensable. A ruler might have a dozen painters competing for commissions, but a brilliant weapons designer was irreplaceable. Leonardo was calculating his survival through utility that transcended art. The drawings he created during these 18 months reveal astonishing breadth. Giant crossbows, capable of hurling stones that could demolish walls. Multi-barreled guns that could fire in rapid succession, anticipating machine gun principles. Armored vehicles that prefigured tanks, with soldiers protected inside while firing through slits. Bridges that could be assembled and disassembled rapidly for river crossings. Scaling ladders, siege towers, mortars, explosives, chemical weapons. Some designs were practical, based on existing technology pushed to new extremes. Others were visionary, incorporating principles that wouldn't be technically feasible for centuries. But all were presented with the artistic skill that made Leonardo's drawings irresistible. These weren't crude technical sketches. They were beautiful, detailed illustrations that showed machines in operation, with tiny figures demonstrating scale and use. With mechanical details rendered in perfect perspective, he was creating a calling card for rulers who valued power over piety. His target was Ludovico Sforza. Called Il Moro, the de facto ruler of Milan, Ludovico had seized power from his nephew, maintaining control through military strength and political maneuvering. He was ambitious, dangerous, and hungry for technological advantages over rival city-states. He was also a patron of arts, but Leonardo understood that in Ludovico's court, art served power rather than the reverse. In 1482 or 1483, the exact date uncertain, Leonardo wrote a letter to Ludovico that ranks among the most remarkable job applications in history. He listed his capabilities not as artist, but as military engineer. He could design portable bridges for pursuing or fleeing armies. He could drain moats and destroy fortifications. He could create bombards and mortars. He could tunnel under walls. He could build armored vehicles. He could design buildings that could withstand siege. And then, almost as an afterthought in the final paragraph, he mentioned that he could also paint and sculpt. The letter was strategic genius. Leonardo was offering to make Ludovico more powerful, more secure, more capable of defending Milan against the constant threats from Venice, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. The artistic skills that had defined Leonardo's identity became a footnote to military utility. We don't know if Ludovico ever read the letter. We know Leonardo arrived in Milan and entered the Duke's service, beginning 17 years that would be the most productive and most desperate of his life. Milan was larger than Florence, richer, more politically complex. The Sforza court employed hundreds of people in various capacities, and Leonardo entered it as one among many talented individuals competing for the Duke's attention and payment. His salary was irregular, often months in arrears, and he was assigned projects that had nothing to do with the military engineering he'd proposed. Ludovico wanted a horse. Not a real horse, but the largest bronze equestrian statue ever created, honoring Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. It would be a monument to power, visible across Milan, proclaiming Sforza legitimacy and magnificence. Leonardo was assigned to design and create it. The project consumed him. The final design called for a horse over 24 feet tall, weighing approximately 75 tons when cast in bronze. Nothing on this scale had been attempted since antiquity. The technical challenges were immense. Creating a clay model that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Designing a casting method that could handle the volume of molten bronze. Ensuring the final statue wouldn't crack or deform as it cooled, Leonardo threw himself into the work with obsessive attention. He studied horses, measuring them, drawing them from every angle, dissecting dead ones to understand musculature and skeletal structure. His notebooks filled with calculations about weight distribution, center of gravity, casting temperatures, bronze alloys. He built scale models, testing different poses, different proportions, different approaches to the technical problems. The clay model took years. When finally completed and displayed to the public in 1493, it was recognized as a masterwork. The horse was shown rearing on its hind legs, a pose of extraordinary difficulty that no one had successfully cast in bronze at any size, let alone at this scale. Leonardo had designed internal supports, hollow sections, a casting method that would pour the bronze in stages. But as the model stood in the Duke's palace, awaiting the bronze that would make it permanent, Leonardo's financial situation deteriorated. Ludovico paid irregularly, often responding to Leonardo's requests for salary with promises rather than money. Leonardo began pawning possessions. His winter clothes disappeared to pawnshops. He shared rooms with other artists to split rent. He borrowed money from friends, recording debts in his notebooks with the shame of someone who had once imagined genius would ensure prosperity. During these years, plague struck Milan repeatedly. In 1485, a particularly severe outbreak killed an estimated 50,000 people in a city of perhaps 120,000. Bodies piled in streets faster than they could be removed. The stench of death hung over the city. Wealthy citizens fled to country estates. Those who remained lived in terror of infection. Leonardo responded by designing an ideal city, plague-proof through urban planning. He proposed a two-level system. The upper level would be for pedestrians, clean and orderly, with buildings set back from wide streets to allow sunlight and air circulation. The lower level would carry sewage, goods transportation, and commercial traffic. Water would flow through the lower level constantly, flushing waste away rather than letting it accumulate. Buildings would have standardized sewage systems, emptying into the lower channels rather than into streets or the river. The designs were brilliant, anticipating modern urban planning principles by centuries. They showed understanding of disease transmission that preceded germ theory. But Ludovico had no money to rebuild Milan, according to Leonardo's vision. The plans remained in notebooks, visionary ideas without implementation. Leonardo took other work to survive. He designed elaborate theatrical productions for court celebrations, creating mechanical lions that walked and opened to reveal flowers, designing stage machinery that could create effects of storms, sunrises, transformations. He painted portraits of Ludovico's mistresses. He designed fortifications for Milan's defenses. He consulted on engineering projects, irrigation systems, canal improvements. All the while, the bronze for his horse remained uncast. Ludovico kept promising that soon, very soon, the foundries would be dedicated to the project. Leonardo kept refining his designs, calculating and recalculating, preparing for a casting that never happened. He begged. His letters to Ludovico from this period make painful reading. He needed money for food, for rent, for materials. He had worked for years on the horse. He had other projects ready to execute if only he had payment for work already completed. He didn't phrase it as complaint, but as reminder, professional communications that barely concealed desperation. In 1494, France began making territorial claims in Italy. Charles VIII assembled an army to assert French rights to the Kingdom of Naples, and that army would have to pass through or near Milan. Ludovico, facing potential invasion, needed weapons more than monuments. The 75 tons of bronze that had been earmarked for Leonardo's horse was melted down and cast into cannons. Leonardo's masterwork, the project that had consumed years of his life, would never be cast. The clay model stood in the palace, a testament to what might have been. And worse was coming. In 1499, the French invasion that Ludovico had feared finally materialized. But instead of passing through Milan, the French claimed it. Ludovico fled. French troops occupied the city, and soldiers, looking for target practice, used Leonardo's clay horse, standing unprotected in the palace courtyard. They destroyed it. 17 years of work, thousands of drawings, calculations, innovations, the largest sculptural project attempted in centuries, reduced to rubble by crossbow bolts and thrown stones. Leonardo's monument to his patron's father became entertainment for invading soldiers. Everything he had built in Milan collapsed in months. His salary from Ludovico stopped. His apartments were no longer accessible. His position as court artist and engineer vanished with the court itself. He was 50 years old, without employment, without savings, watching French soldiers occupy the city where he'd spent the last 2 decades. But from those 17 years of survival, of constant adaptation, of begging for overdue payments while creating masterworks, Leonardo had learned something crucial. Art alone couldn't sustain him. Patronage was unreliable. Power was temporary. He needed to become indispensable through skills that transcended any single ruler's whims. He had arrived in Milan as a fugitive from Florence's accusations, presenting himself as a military engineer to gain protection. He had survived through incredible versatility, painting, sculpting, designing, engineering, entertaining, whatever the Duke needed. He had lived on the edge of poverty while creating some of the most ambitious projects of the Renaissance. And through it all, through the desperate years of pawned clothes and shared rooms and begging letters, he had been observing, documenting, discovering. His notebooks from the Milan years contain some of his most important scientific observations: anatomy, optics, hydraulics, geology, astronomy, mathematics. The desperation that forced him to take any available work also exposed him to an extraordinary range of problems that fed his curiosity. The French occupation forced Leonardo to leave Milan, to become a wanderer again, seeking new patrons. new opportunities, new ways to survive. The horse was gone. The stable position was gone. At 50, he had to reinvent himself once more. But this time, he had something he'd lacked at 24 when fleeing Florence's accusations. He had reputation. His name was known throughout Italy. His skills were documented in works scattered across the cities where he'd lived. He was no longer the illegitimate apprentice sleeping with grinding stones. He was Leonardo da Vinci. Though that name still carried the stigma of bastard birth, the accomplishments were undeniable. The wars of survival weren't over. They would continue until his death. But he had learned to fight them not with weapons, but with ideas, with skills so diverse that he could adapt to whatever circumstances demanded. The accusations that drove him from Florence, the desperate years begging Ludovico for payment, the destruction of his greatest sculptural project, all of it was forging something unprecedented, a mind that could not rest, could not accept limits, could not stop discovering even when discovery brought no immediate reward. Poverty and persecution hadn't destroyed Leonardo. They had refined him, stripped away everything except the essential drive to understand, to create, to see what others missed. And his greatest works, the paintings and discoveries that would make him immortal, were still ahead. Born from the same desperation that had sustained him through 17 years in Milan, through accusations and dismissals and destroyed dreams. The machinery of genius assembled in Verrocchio's workshop had been tested by survival. Now it would create masterworks. Financial desperation creates urgency, and urgency sometimes produces miracles. After fleeing Milan in 1499, Leonardo wandered between cities, seeking commissions that could sustain him. Venice briefly, then back to Florence, where he hadn't lived for nearly 2 decades. The city had changed. The Medici had been expelled, then returned. Political power had shifted. New artists had emerged. Michelangelo, 23 years younger than Leonardo, was creating sculptures that stunned viewers with their raw power. Leonardo needed to prove himself relevant. In 1503, he received a commission that should have secured his reputation and finances. The Florentine Republic wanted a massive battle scene, painted in the great council hall of the Palazzo Vecchio, commemorating the Battle of Anghiari, where Florence had defeated Milan 57 years earlier. The wall space was enormous. The fee was substantial. This was Leonardo's opportunity to create a public masterwork that would establish him as Florence's greatest painter. He approached it with characteristic ambition and experimental techniques. Rather than using traditional fresco methods, painting into wet plaster that would dry and preserve the image, Leonardo developed a new approach using oil paints on a treated wall surface. He had experimented with oils for years, understanding how they could be layered for luminous effects impossible with fresco's quick-drying constraints. The central scene showed cavalry in violent combat, horses rearing, soldiers fighting with savage intensity, flags tangled in the chaos. Leonardo's preliminary drawings reveal his vision. This wouldn't be a sanitized, heroic representation of battle. It would show war's brutal reality, the terror in horses' eyes, the desperate struggle for survival, the moment when human civilization dissolved into animal violence. He began painting, and the wall began melting. The oil paints applied to Leonardo's experimental ground wouldn't dry properly in Florence's humid climate. Colors began running, mixing, sliding down the wall. He tried applying heat to accelerate drying, using braziers to warm the surface. The heat made it worse, causing the paints to liquefy further, creating streaks and drips that destroyed the careful composition. Leonardo watched his most important public commission disintegrate before his eyes. Months of work, the Republic's money, his reputation, all melting down the wall in slow motion. He abandoned the project. The partial painting remained visible for years, a monument to failed ambition, before being covered over or destroyed. But here's what makes this disaster crucial to understanding Leonardo's genius. The experimental techniques that failed on the wall taught him something profound about how oil paints behaved, how they could be layered in extremely thin glazes to create effects he'd been pursuing for decades. The failure contained seeds of his greatest success. Around 1503, a wealthy Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo commissioned Leonardo to paint a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini. It was not a prestigious commission. Portrait painting paid far less than grand battle scenes or religious works. Lisa Gherardini was not nobility, not a famous beauty, not anyone whose face would mean anything to anyone outside her immediate family. Leonardo accepted the commission because he needed money. But what he created would become the most famous painting in human history. He worked on the portrait for approximately 4 years, an absurd length of time for what should have been a straightforward commission. Francesco del Giocondo likely wondered why Leonardo kept the painting, kept requesting additional sittings, kept claiming it wasn't quite finished. The answer was that Leonardo wasn't painting a portrait in any conventional sense. He was solving problems of representation that had obsessed him for decades. Between painting sessions, he was dissecting corpses. Specifically, he was studying facial muscles, documenting the 43 muscles that create human expressions. He needed to understand how smiles formed, not symbolically but mechanically. Which muscles contracted? How did skin stretch over underlying structures? What created the subtle asymmetries that made expressions feel genuine rather than frozen? His anatomical drawings from this period show faces with skin peeled back, revealing the muscular architecture beneath. He drew the same smile from multiple angles, showing how different muscles engaged to create what we perceive as a single expression. He was reverse engineering human emotion through cadaver dissection. He applied what he learned to Lisa Gherardini's portrait. The famous smile isn't mysterious because Leonardo painted it ambiguously. It's mysterious because he painted it accurately. Human smiles are complex, dynamic, involving dozens of muscles working in coordination. They're never quite the same from moment to moment, never symmetrical, never entirely readable. Leonardo captured that complexity, that sense of an expression in transition, alive rather than posed. But the face alone wasn't enough. Leonardo was pursuing something more ambitious. He wanted to paint atmosphere itself, the way air and light interact to soften distant objects, to blur edges, to create depth through optical phenomena rather than linear perspective alone. He had studied optics for years, understanding that human vision doesn't work like geometry textbooks suggested. We don't see sharp edges in nature. We see gradual transitions where objects meet air, where light scatters through atmosphere. He had observed how mountains appear progressively bluer and less distinct as they recede into distance, how humidity affects visibility, how particles in air create hazing effects. Now he needed to paint these observations, and he was doing it without money for expensive pigments. The technique he developed, which became known as sfumato, meaning smoky or vanished, relied on the experimental methods he'd been forced to develop through poverty. He couldn't afford thick applications of expensive pigments, so he'd learned to stretch them by layering translucent glazes. Each layer was so thin that light could pass partially through it before reflecting back, creating luminosity that opaque paint couldn't achieve. For the Mona Lisa, he applied this method with obsessive precision. Dozens of layers, each thinner than a human hair, building up forms not through outlines but through subtle gradations of tone. The technique required patience that bordered on madness. Each layer had to dry completely before the next could be applied. With oil paints, this meant waiting days or weeks between applications, but the result was unprecedented. The face emerged from shadow without hard edges. The landscape behind faded into atmospheric distance so convincing that it seemed you could walk into it. The hands, positioned in the foreground, showed anatomical understanding that made them sculptural yet soft. Every element demonstrated mastery of different observational sciences applied to paint. He never delivered the painting to Francesco del Giocondo. By the time Leonardo considered it sufficiently complete, which may have been never, he had moved beyond needing the commission fee. Or perhaps he recognized that what he'd created exceeded the boundaries of normal patronage. The painting wasn't a portrait of Lisa Gherardini. It was a demonstration of everything Leonardo had learned about optics, anatomy, geology, and human perception. The Last Supper emerged from similar circumstances of constraint, creating innovation. In 1495, while still in Milan, Leonardo received a commission from the Duke to paint the refectory wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie. The subject was Christianity's most painted scene, Christ announcing that one of his disciples would betray him. The moment of revelation before the Passion. Leonardo couldn't afford assistants to help with a wall this large. Traditional fresco technique required teams of workers mixing plaster, preparing surfaces, painting quickly before the plaster dried. Leonardo worked alone, which meant fresco speed requirements were impossible. He developed a different method, a tempera and oil mixture applied to a treated dry wall, allowing him to work at his own pace, to revise, to layer colors for depth. The composition he designed was revolutionary. Previous Last Suppers arranged apostles in a line, haloed figures identified by symbols and positioning. Leonardo rejected all of it. He painted the moment of psychological drama, 12 men reacting in real time to shocking news. Their gestures, expressions, groupings all revealed character and emotion. Judas wasn't segregated or marked by a halo's absence. He was part of the composition, identified by gesture and shadow, sitting among the others as he would have in the actual event. The perspective was calculated to extend the refectory's architecture, creating the illusion that the painted room continued the actual room. When monks ate their meals, Christ and his disciples appeared to dine at a table in the same space, sharing their world rather than existing in sacred separation. But Leonardo's experimental technique began failing almost immediately. The paint didn't bond properly to the treated wall. Within years, portions began flaking. Within decades, significant damage was visible. By the time Leonardo died, his masterwork was already deteriorating. Every subsequent century brought more decay, damage from humidity, misguided restoration attempts. Even Napoleon's troops, using the refectory as a stable, yet the composition's power was so profound that even damaged, even partially destroyed, the Last Supper changed how narrative art functioned. Leonardo had demonstrated that painting could capture psychological complexity, that sacred subjects could be humanized without losing spiritual power. That innovation in technique could create new possibilities for representation. Both masterworks emerged from Leonardo's inability to work conventionally. The Mona Lisa exists because poverty had taught him to layer cheap pigments into luminous effects. The Last Supper's composition emerged from working alone, too poor to hire assistants, forced to develop methods that allowed solitary execution. The Battle of Anghiari disaster, the wall melting before his eyes, taught him precisely how not to apply experimental techniques to public commissions. But it also taught him how oils behaved, how heat affected them, how layering worked, lessons that made the Mona Lisa possible. This is poverty's alchemy. Constraints forcing innovation, failure teaching success, desperation creating methods that genius could exploit. Leonardo didn't succeed despite his circumstances. His circumstances created the conditions under which his particular mind could revolutionize art. 13,000 pages. That's what survived of Leonardo's notebooks, and scholars estimate this represents perhaps 1/4 of what he actually produced. 13,000 pages written backwards in mirror script, cramming every margin with observations, calculations, drawings, questions. Pages that could have revolutionized science if anyone had been able to read them, understand them, and recognize their importance during Leonardo's lifetime. But no one did. The notebooks remained scattered, private, encrypted not through deliberate code, but through the accident of left-handed poverty and insatiable curiosity. They contained discoveries that wouldn't be officially recognized for centuries. and they reveal the true scope of a mind that couldn't stop investigating, even when investigation brought no reward. Consider the anatomy. Leonardo dissected approximately 30 human corpses over his lifetime, working mostly at night in cold seasons when decomposition slowed. These weren't official medical investigations. Leonardo had no university credentials, no medical degree, no authority to perform systematic anatomical research. He was an artist seeking to understand the machinery beneath skin. He gained access to bodies through hospitals and morgues that couldn't identify the deceased or locate families to claim them. Paupers, criminals, plague victims, unnamed dead. He worked by candlelight, cutting carefully, drawing what he found, racing against decay that could make a corpse unusable within days, even in winter. His anatomical drawings are astonishing, not just for their artistic quality, but for their scientific accuracy. He drew the heart with its 4 chambers when medical textbooks still claimed it had 3. He showed heart valves that prevented backward flow of blood. He documented the branching of blood vessels with such precision that his drawings match modern medical illustrations. He discovered that blood vessels narrow as we age, proposing this as the cause of elderly deaths, a theory that anticipated modern understanding of arteriosclerosis by 400 years. He drew the fetus in the womb, showing its position, the umbilical cord, the structure of the placenta. He documented the spine's curves, understanding how they distributed weight for upright posture. He found that the brain's ventricles contained fluid, not souls, as religious doctrine claimed. He mapped cranial nerves. He drew the eye's anatomy, understanding how the lens inverted images on the retina. He documented muscles layer by layer, showing how they worked as mechanical systems, how tendons transferred force, how bones served as levers. All of this was hidden in notebooks, written backwards, mixed with observations about painting techniques and engineering problems. He couldn't publish. Dissection was legally restricted, theologically questionable, socially repugnant. Claiming the heart had 4 chambers contradicted Galen, the ancient authority the church endorsed. Showing fetuses in the womb too accurately might raise questions about ensoulment timing that could lead to heresy charges. So Leonardo documented his discoveries for himself, or for some imagined future when people might understand. The knowledge died with him, scattered across notebooks that would spend centuries in private collections, unread because they were backwards, undervalued because they seemed like artists' sketches rather than scientific investigation. His geological observations were equally revolutionary and equally hidden. His work on canal engineering projects took him through northern Italy, where he examined rock formations, studied erosion patterns, documented water flow through different materials. He found marine fossils embedded in mountainsides, miles from any ocean, thousands of feet above sea level. The official explanation, endorsed by church doctrine, was Noah's flood. The waters had covered even the highest mountains, depositing sea creatures that died when the waters receded. Leonardo's observations contradicted this at every level. The fossils weren't scattered randomly, as flood debris would be. They were organized in distinct layers, sometimes miles thick. Different layers contained different species, suggesting different time periods. The fossils weren't jumbled together, but positioned as if the creatures had lived and died where they were found. Buried gradually by sediment, Leonardo calculated how long it would take rivers to deposit sediment layers thousands of feet thick. Not 40 days, not thousands of years. He understood that Earth must be immensely old, that mountains rose and fell over timescales that made human history vanish into insignificance. He was calculating Earth's age in millions of years, while Genesis claimed 6,000. He couldn't publish any of this. Challenging biblical chronology was heresy, punishable by the same burning that sodomy charges had threatened. So he hid his geological observations in notes about painting landscapes, disguising science as art instruction. How to paint mountains realistically required understanding how they formed, how erosion carved valleys, how rivers created their paths. An artist needed to know these things. That the knowledge contradicted Genesis was simply unfortunate. His notebooks contained calculations about water flow that anticipated fluid dynamics. He observed that water flowing past obstacles created vortices, that these vortices followed mathematical patterns, that the same patterns appeared at different scales. He drew water turbulence with such precision that modern physicists recognize accurate representations of complex fluid behavior. He studied birds obsessively, understanding that flight required more than flapping wings. He documented how birds used air currents, how they adjusted wing angles for steering, how they landed by stalling airflow at precise moments. He bought caged birds at markets and freed them, watching how they accelerated from rest, studying the mechanics of takeoff. From these observations, he designed flying machines. Not mystical dreams of human flight, but engineering attempts to apply bird mechanics to human-powered devices. Most designs were impractical, requiring more power than human muscles could generate. But the principles were sound. He understood lift, drag, control surfaces, weight distribution. He was designing aircraft 400 years before the Wright brothers, using materials available in the Renaissance, recording everything in backwards, writing on expensive paper he could barely afford. The paper itself tells a story of poverty. Leonardo used every scrap, every margin, both sides of every sheet. When paper was too expensive to buy, he wrote on whatever materials he could find. Some notebooks contained pages of different sizes, different qualities, bound together because he couldn't afford uniform volumes. He drew over previous sketches when fresh paper wasn't available, creating palimpsests where multiple investigations layered on single pages. His mirror writing maximized this scarce resource. Backwards text was more compact, used ink efficiently, prevented smearing that wasted space. What began as practical solution to left-handed writing with cheap ink became his signature method, creating accidental encryption that preserved ideas until centuries after his death. The notebooks reveal a mind that couldn't specialize, couldn't focus on single subjects, couldn't stop asking questions. Anatomy bleeds into engineering. Geology connects to painting technique. Optics inform architecture. Mathematics describe everything. He was pursuing unified understanding, seeing patterns that connected disparate phenomena. He noticed that water flowing in rivers branched like blood flowing through vessels, that both systems followed similar mathematical patterns. He observed that tree branches divided following the same principles as blood vessels, that total cross-sectional area remained constant at each branching level. He was discovering fractals, self-similar patterns that repeat at different scales. Centuries before mathematics developed language to describe them, he studied the strength of materials, testing how different woods supported weight, how ropes handled tension, how arches distributed force. He designed bridges using these principles, calculating spans and supports, proposing structures that wouldn't be built for hundreds of years, but that demonstrated accurate understanding of mechanical stress. He investigated sound, understanding that it traveled in waves, that pitch related to wave frequency, that musical intervals had mathematical relationships. He designed instruments, experimented with acoustics, proposed theories about how ears detected different frequencies. He mapped cities from aerial viewpoints that wouldn't be achievable until flight was invented. He drew bird's-eye views, showing streets, buildings, fortifications with such accuracy that they served as functional maps. He was imagining perspectives that his eyes had never seen, extrapolating from understanding of how space worked. And through all of this, through decades of investigation that no one paid him to conduct, he remained poor. The notebooks represent thousands of hours that could have been spent painting commissions, creating works that would pay rent and buy food. Instead, he dissected corpses in freezing rooms, studied rock formations, designed machines that would never be built, documented observations that no one would read. Why? What drove this compulsive investigation that brought no reward? Perhaps because investigation itself was the reward. Perhaps because his mind couldn't rest without understanding how things worked. Perhaps because poverty had taught him that conventional paths offered no security, that his survival depended on knowing what others didn't, seeing what others missed. The notebooks were his real masterwork, not the paintings that made him famous, though those represented genius equal to anything human hands had achieved. The notebooks contained the architecture of a mind that refused to accept mystery, that demanded to understand, that saw connections invisible to everyone else. They remained scattered for centuries after his death. Some volumes disappeared, some were cut apart, individual pages sold to collectors who valued them as artwork without understanding their scientific content. Some were hidden in private libraries, unread because the backwards writing seemed too difficult to decipher. Some were lost to fire, flood, war, the casual destruction that claims most human creation, but enough survived to reveal what Leonardo actually was. Not primarily an artist, though he revolutionized art. Not an engineer, though his designs were brilliant. Not an anatomist or geologist or physicist, though his work in all these fields preceded official discovery by centuries. Leonardo was an investigator, someone who looked at the world and refused to stop asking why. Someone whose poverty and exclusion freed him from the constraints that kept others within established boundaries. Someone whose notebooks recorded not just answers, but the process of questioning, the joy of discovery, the connection between things that seemed separate. 13,000 pages survived. They're worth fortunes now, but in Leonardo's lifetime, they were just notebooks. Backwards writing on expensive paper, hiding knowledge that the world wasn't ready to receive. In 1517, at the age of 64, Leonardo crossed the Alps on a mule, his right hand partially paralyzed from what was likely a stroke. In his saddlebags, wrapped carefully in cloth, he carried 3 paintings: the Mona Lisa, St. John the Baptist, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. Everything else he'd created over 6 decades remained scattered across Italy. These 3 paintings were all he chose to bring into his final years. King Francis I of France had invited him, not to paint, not to engineer, but simply to exist. The young king, only 23 years old, was building a court that would rival any in Europe for magnificence and learning. He wanted Leonardo not for specific commissions, but for the prestige of housing genius, for conversations, for whatever the old master might choose to create or discover. Francis installed Leonardo in the Château du Clos-Lucé, a manor house in Amboise connected to the royal chateau by an underground passage. The king reportedly visited often, sometimes daily, coming through the tunnel to talk with Leonardo about art, science, philosophy, whatever interested them. For the first time in Leonardo's life, patronage came without desperate conditions. The salary was generous, paid reliably. There were no urgent commissions, no creditors demanding payment, no need to pawn possessions to survive winter. At 64, Leonardo had finally achieved financial security, and he used it to investigate. He designed an ideal city for Francis, drawing on decades of urban planning thought. The plan showed a 2-level system similar to what he'd proposed for plague-ravaged Milan decades earlier, but refined, more detailed. The upper level for people, clean and organized with wide streets and planned sightlines. The lower level for sewage, delivery of goods, water channels that would constantly flush waste away. Buildings designed with sanitation systems, with air circulation, with proportions that promoted health. He proposed moving the Loire River, or at least controlling it, with a canal system that would prevent flooding, provide irrigation, enable transportation. The engineering calculations filled notebook pages. Where to dig, how deep, what angles, what materials. He was 70 years old by the time these plans reached full development, his paralyzed hand making drawing difficult, but his mind remained relentless. He designed an automated lion for Francis, a mechanical creature that could walk across a room, stop before the king, and open its chest to reveal lilies. the symbol of French monarchy. The lion combined Leonardo's understanding of mechanics with theatrical flair, creating wonder through engineering. It performed successfully, though no detailed drawings of its mechanism survived. He continued his anatomical work when he could get access to bodies. His final anatomical drawings show an old man's body, every detail documented. The deteriorated muscles, the calcified arteries, the worn joints. Some scholars believe this might have been a self-portrait in the only medium Leonardo truly mastered. Not the face in a mirror, but the machinery that had carried him through nearly 7 decades. His mother died during these French years. Caterina, the peasant woman who had borne him and then vanished into obscurity, reappeared in Leonardo's life near its end. He had brought her to live in his household, employed her as a servant, housed her while her health failed. The records show expenses for her burial, noting her as a servant in Leonardo's home. But she was his mother, the woman he'd barely known, whose absence had shaped his childhood as profoundly as Antonio's recognition or Albira's teaching. Did they talk about the farmhouse in Vinci? About her life with a Caterina the troublemaker? About what it felt like to give birth to genius and then watch it disappear into a world she couldn't enter? We have no record of their conversations, only the burial expenses, the notation that Leonardo paid, the acknowledgement that she mattered enough to house but not enough to publicly claim. She died in his arms, according to some accounts. The peasant mother and the genius son, connected by blood and separation, together at the end. What Leonardo felt he didn't record, or those records are among the thousands of notebook pages that didn't survive. His final notebooks show his thinking reaching toward synthesis. He wasn't just documenting observations anymore. He was finding patterns that connected everything. Water flow followed mathematical principles that also described blood circulation. The same equations that predicted how rivers carved valleys explained how arteries narrowed with age. Tree branching used the same geometry as blood vessel division. He was pursuing unified theory, understanding that the same fundamental principles governed phenomena that seemed completely different. This was physics, biology, geology, and mathematics, woven together through observation and calculation. He didn't have modern scientific language to express what he was discovering, but the relationships were there in his drawings, his notes, his recognition that nature repeated patterns at every scale. His exploration of turbulence intensified. Water flowing past obstacles created vortices that followed predictable patterns. Air flowing over wings generated lift through similar principles. Blood flowing through the heart created swirls that helped valves close. He drew these patterns obsessively, showing how the same spiral forms appeared in water, air, blood, how they scaled from tiny to massive while maintaining mathematical consistency. He studied the heart's structure with particular intensity, proposing that it functioned as a pump, that blood circulated rather than being consumed and regenerated as Galen claimed. He was correct, but lacked the technology to prove circulation experimentally. His drawings showed the principle, the understanding was there, but confirmation would wait another century for William Harvey's work. His geological observations expanded through access to French landscapes. He examined river valleys, understanding how water carved them over immense time. He studied erosion, sedimentation, the slow transformation of land that human lifespans couldn't perceive directly. He was thinking in deep time, in millions of years, while everyone around him measured history in thousands. Francis valued all of this. The king wasn't demanding practical applications or finished commissions. He wanted Leonardo's mind active, creating, discovering. It was patronage, as it should have been all along, supporting genius to see what genius would produce, rather than constraining it to specific deliverables. But Leonardo's body was failing. The paralyzed hand made drawing difficult, then impossible. He could still write, still calculate, but the precise rendering that had been his gift was slipping away. His eyesight weakened, his energy diminished. At 67, After 3 years in France, he knew his time was ending. He wrote his will, a document that reveals his final circumstances. He owned 3 paintings, the ones he'd carried from Italy. He owned his clothes, his books, his notebooks, his instruments. He had some savings from Francis's generous salary. He left money to servants, to Caterina's heirs, to his assistant Francesco Melzi. The paintings, the notebooks, everything intellectual went to Melzi. This was significant. Melzi had been with Leonardo for years, copying notes, organizing papers, understanding the scope of the investigation. Leonardo trusted him to preserve the work, perhaps to eventually make sense of it, to find ways to share the discoveries with people who might understand. Leonardo died on May 2nd, 1519. The romantic story claims he died in King Francis's arms, that the young king held him as he passed, honoring the genius he'd protected. The truth is probably less dramatic. Francis was elsewhere that day, probably. Leonardo died in his bed, attended by servants and Melzi, his body finally failing after decades of relentless use. He was 67 years old. He had lived through plague, war, accusations that could have led to burning, poverty that forced him to pawn winter clothes, the destruction of his greatest sculptural work, the slow deterioration of his greatest painting, constant wandering in search of patronage. He had revolutionized art, made discoveries in anatomy, geology, engineering, mathematics, and physics that wouldn't be officially recognized for centuries. And at the end, he owned almost nothing. 3 paintings, some notebooks, a few instruments, the clothes on his back. The accumulated material wealth from 6 decades of genius could fit in a single cart, but those notebooks, 6,000 pages survived of his writing, estimated to be 1/4 of what he actually produced. Melzi took them, organized them as best he could, spent decades trying to create coherent volumes from Leonardo's scattered investigations. When Melzi died, the notebooks scattered. His heirs sold them, gave them away, lost them. The pages that survived ended up in private collections, royal libraries, museums. In 1994, Bill Gates paid $30,800,000 for 72 pages. The Codex Leicester, containing observations about water, geology, astronomy, and light. $30 million for 72 pages written backwards on Renaissance paper, hiding knowledge that could have transformed science if anyone had read it when it mattered. The supreme irony. History's most valuable artist died with nothing. The man who had revolutionized painting, whose techniques every artist after him would study, who had created works that would become priceless, owned 3 paintings, 2 of which he'd never sold because he'd never quite finished them to his satisfaction. He died before completing the Mona Lisa, though he'd worked on it for over a decade. Or perhaps it was complete, and Leonardo simply couldn't bear to surrender it, to let this demonstration of everything he'd learned enter someone else's possession. The painting went to Francis eventually, after Leonardo's death, part of the estate that the king claimed. It would hang in French royal collections for centuries before ending up in the Louvre, behind bulletproof glass, viewed by millions who recognized the face without understanding how poverty, persecution, and obsessive investigation created it. Leonardo died believing he'd failed. He'd left so much unfinished. The Last Supper was already deteriorating. The Battle of Anghiari had melted off the wall. The bronze horse existed only in drawings, the clay model destroyed by French soldiers. His notebooks contained discoveries no one would read. His inventions remained unbuilt. His unified theories connecting all natural phenomena remained partially formed, hinted at but not fully expressed. He died not knowing that he'd succeeded beyond any measure Renaissance Italy could recognize, that his techniques would define painting for centuries, that his notebooks would eventually be recognized as revolutionary, that his name would become synonymous with genius itself. In the Château du Clos Lucé, in a comfortable room provided by a generous patron, Leonardo da Vinci closed his eyes for the final time. The illegitimate boy from Vinci, denied inheritance and education, had investigated his way to immortality. But he died as he'd lived, curious until the end, questioning until there were no more questions, seeing what others missed, even when seeing brought no reward. Step back now and consider what poverty actually created, not despite Leonardo's genius, but as the engine that generated it. Every constraint that should have destroyed him instead refined his thinking, forced innovation, created methods that transcended the limitations meant to contain him. His illegitimate birth was catastrophic by Renaissance standards. It denied him everything that determined success in 15th century Italy. No inheritance, no guild membership, no university education, no access to his father's profession, no legitimate place in society's hierarchy. Every official document that ever mentioned him included the stigma, illegitimate bastard, the mark that should have confined him to poverty and obscurity. But that same illegitimacy freed him from Latin education's constraints. While legitimate sons memorized classical texts, learning what Aristotle claimed about nature, Leonardo wandered hills, learning what nature actually did. While wealthy students conjugated verbs, Leonardo drew birds in flight, documenting mechanics that contradicted ancient authority. While proper education channeled minds into received wisdom, Leonardo's exclusion forced direct observation. Consider what this meant for his development. He never learned that Galen's anatomical texts were authoritative. He dissected bodies and drew what he found, discovering that hearts had 4 chambers, regardless of what medical schools taught. He never studied Ptolemaic astronomy as sacred truth. He observed stars and planets, calculating movements that suggested Earth wasn't the center of everything. His lack of formal education meant he had no intellectual investment in protecting established knowledge. He could question everything because he'd never been taught that questioning was inappropriate. His illegitimacy, the curse that marked every document bearing his name, created space for unprecedented freedom of thought. Poverty shaped his artistic innovations just as profoundly. His techniques didn't emerge from abundance, allowing experimentation. They emerged from scarcity, demanding efficiency. He couldn't afford expensive ultramarine, so he learned to layer cheap pigments until they created similar effects. That discovery led to sfumato, to the luminous quality that made his painting seem alive. He couldn't afford large workshops with teams of assistants. Working alone meant he needed techniques that one person could execute. The Last Supper's slow drying methods emerged from this constraint, allowing him to work and rework sections without teams of painters filling in backgrounds while the plaster stayed wet. He couldn't afford to waste materials. Every scrap of paper became precious, leading to the dense notation style that filled margins, wrote backwards to prevent smearing, maximized every square inch. That economy of materials created notebooks so rich with observation that 6,000 surviving pages contain revolutionary discoveries in multiple sciences. His constant relocations, often fleeing creditors or seeking new patrons after money ran out, forced portable methods. He couldn't maintain elaborate studios with permanent equipment. Everything had to be transportable. That constraint pushed him toward techniques that later artists would adopt precisely because they were flexible, adaptable, efficient. The 24 years between Florence and Milan, the desperate years begging Ludovico Sforza for overdue payments, taught him versatility that no secure position would have demanded. He designed weapons, theatrical productions, plague-proof cities, irrigation systems, fortifications, whatever might earn money. Each project forced him to understand new domains, to see connections between different fields, to recognize that principles from one discipline applied to others. That forced versatility created the interdisciplinary thinking that makes his notebooks so remarkable. He saw that water flow, blood circulation, and tree branching followed the same mathematical principles because he'd worked on hydraulic engineering, anatomical dissection, and landscape painting, all as economic necessities. The unified understanding emerged from desperation. His poverty also meant he studied subjects wealthy artists ignored. Wealthy painters hired models and paid them to hold poses for hours. Leonardo memorized anatomy at public baths, where anyone could observe human bodies for minimal cost. That forced memorization meant he understood structure and movement at depths that casual observation from paid models couldn't provide. He collected injured birds from markets, where they cost almost nothing, healing them while studying flight mechanics. Wealthy investigators might have kept aviaries, paying handlers to maintain exotic species. Leonardo's handful of rescued sparrows and pigeons taught him more because he watched them constantly, because healing them meant understanding how their bodies worked, because poverty transformed every observation into vital knowledge, even the sodomy accusations. The terror that forced him to flee Florence shaped his development. They taught him that talent couldn't protect him, that he needed practical skills rulers would value above artistic ability. The military engineering portfolio he created to escape persecution became the foundation for 17 years in Milan, where he designed everything from canal systems to cathedral construction while painting masterpieces. Imagine an alternate Leonardo. Born legitimate, inheriting property, joining the notary guild, receiving university education, following conventional paths to success. That Leonardo might have been successful, might have painted competent religious works for wealthy patrons, might have lived comfortably and died forgotten. The actual Leonardo denied everything conventional success required, created methods that changed civilization, not through comfort and security, but through constant adaptation to circumstances that should have destroyed him. Modern applications from his notebooks demonstrate this perfectly. Engineers study his bridge designs, finding principles that contemporary architecture had forgotten. Medical illustrators recognize that his anatomical drawings show structures and relationships that modern imaging validates. Urban planners examine his two-level city designs, seeing solutions to problems 21st century cities still face. Aeronautical engineers analyze his flying machines, finding that while the execution was impossible with Renaissance materials, the principles were sound. The Codex Leicester, those 72 pages Bill Gates purchased for $30 million, contains observations about light reflection on water that informed computer graphics algorithms centuries later. Leonardo noticed that moonlight reflecting on waves created specific patterns, that those patterns revealed mathematical relationships between surface angle and viewer position. Pixar used similar principles to render realistic water in animated films. His studies of turbulence, drawn with obsessive detail in his final years, show vortex patterns that match computer simulations of fluid dynamics. He was documenting chaos theory before mathematics had language to describe it, seeing self-similar patterns that repeat at different scales, recognizing that nature followed rules more complex than geometry could capture. His understanding of how human vision works developed through grinding pigments and studying optics, anticipated discoveries that neuroscience would make centuries later. He knew that eyes didn't work like cameras, that perception involved interpretation, that what we see differs from what exists. His paintings exploit this understanding, creating effects that work precisely because he knew how human visual processing functioned. The notebooks scattered after his death demonstrate poverty's final transformation of his legacy. Because Leonardo died owning almost nothing, because he couldn't establish institutions or ensure his work's preservation, the notebooks dispersed randomly. Some ended up in royal collections. Some were sold to collectors who couldn't read them. Some were cut apart, individual pages valued as artwork without understanding their scientific content. This scattering meant his discoveries didn't revolutionize science when they should have. If Leonardo had been wealthy enough to publish, to establish a school, to ensure his observations reached people who could build on them, Renaissance science might have accelerated dramatically. Heart anatomy, blood circulation, geological deep time, atmospheric optics, all documented but invisible to the people who needed to see them. Yet that same scattering also preserved them. Bound volumes might have been destroyed in wars, fires, institutional purges. Scattered pages survived precisely because they seemed unimportant, decorative artists' sketches rather than revolutionary science. They surfaced gradually over centuries, each discovery revealing how far ahead Leonardo had seen. Today, those notebooks are worth fortunes. The institutions that house them protect them like sacred relics. Scholars spend careers analyzing single pages, finding new layers of meaning, discovering that what seemed like casual observation contained profound understanding. The pages Leonardo wrote on cheapest available paper, cramming margins because he couldn't afford waste, are among humanity's most valuable documents. The paintings demonstrate the same transformation. Leonardo died believing he'd failed, that he'd left masterworks unfinished or deteriorating. The Last Supper was already peeling from the wall. The Battle of Anghiari had melted into ruin. He'd never delivered the Mona Lisa after working on it for over a decade, but those failures defined painting for centuries afterward. Every artist who came after Leonardo studied his techniques, tried to understand how he achieved effects that seemed impossible. The sfumato that emerged from stretching cheap pigments became the standard for representing atmosphere and depth. The psychological complexity he brought to the Last Supper changed how narrative art functioned. The Mona Lisa became the most famous painting in human history, viewed by millions who recognized genius even without understanding how poverty created it. Here's the supreme irony. Leonardo spent his life desperate for financial security, constantly seeking patrons who would pay reliably, begging for overdue salaries, pawning possessions to survive. He died owning 3 paintings, some notebooks, basic tools. The accumulated material wealth from 6 decades of revolutionary work could fit in a single cart. Yet he generated more value than Renaissance wealth could imagine. The paintings are priceless, quite literally. You cannot buy the Mona Lisa. It's not for sale at any price. The notebooks scattered across collections represent billions in aggregate value. His techniques influenced every painter who came after him. His discoveries, finally recognized, advanced multiple sciences. His methods of observation and investigation helped create the scientific method itself. Poverty didn't destroy Leonardo da Vinci. It created the conditions under which his particular genius could flourish. Every constraint forced innovation. Every limitation demanded new solutions. Every denial of conventional success opened unconventional possibilities. The illegitimate boy from Vinci, denied inheritance and education, sleeping with grinding stones because he couldn't afford beds, dying in modest comfort after 6 decades of desperation, revolutionized how humanity understands art. Anatomy, geology, engineering, optics, and the very process of investigation itself, not despite poverty. Because of it, that's poverty's immortal engine. Constraints creating innovation, scarcity forcing efficiency, exclusion enabling freedom, desperation generating genius that comfort never could. Leonardo's legacy isn't just the paintings hanging in museums or the notebooks preserved in libraries. It's the demonstration that circumstances meant to destroy can instead transform. That the absence of everything conventional success requires can create space for achievements conventional thinking cannot imagine. Consider that the next time you see the Mona Lisa's face, familiar from endless reproduction, smiling with mathematical precision born from dissecting corpses in freezing rooms, or when you encounter his notebooks, backwards writing, cramming every margin of expensive paper he could barely afford. You're not seeing the triumph of wealth and privilege. You're witnessing what poverty's relentless pressure can forge from genius that refuses to surrender. The illegitimate boy who owned nothing became the mind that defined Renaissance achievement and saw centuries ahead of his time. He died believing he'd failed. History proved that poverty had created immortality.